Imagine the moment when someone you deeply respect walks in on you at your most vulnerable. What happens next? A tense silence, an awkward exchange, or something entirely unexpected? You won't believe how everything unfolded when my uncle caught me in a moment I never anticipated. It all began on a quiet morning, with sunlight streaming through the tall trees surrounding my Uncle Tom's house. The light spilled across the wooden floors in golden streaks, casting a warm glow that made the guest room feel both cozy and unfamiliar. I stood in front of the tall, ornate mirror tucked into the corner, a mirror I'd avoided for years during my visits. The truth was, I had never liked looking at myself. But today felt different. There was something in the air, something intangible, that made me pause and really take myself in. I had been visiting Uncle Tom's house every summer since I was a kid. It was my escape from the chaos of the city, a place where I could hear my own thoughts for once. But this time, it didn't feel like the house had changed. It felt like I had. I studied my reflection with an intensity one couldn't explain. The girl in the mirror wasn't just me. She was someone familiar yet foreign, like meeting an old friend who'd changed in unexpected ways. At 17, I wasn't a child anymore, but I didn't quite feel like an adult either. My face was fuller now, my features softer, and my body, well, it had transformed in ways I was still getting used to. My hips curved in a way they hadn't before, and my waist seemed more defined. I felt taller somehow, more grounded. I ran my fingers through my hair, which now fell past my shoulders in soft, natural waves. For years, I'd fought to tame it, but today it looked like it had a mind of its own, effortlessly framing my face. It was strange to think about how much I'd hated my reflection growing up, but as I stood there, I couldn't help but feel a spark of confidence, a newfound appreciation for the person I was becoming. The light from the window bathed my skin in a soft, golden hue, and for the first time, I felt like I was seeing myself as I truly was. Not just a girl, but someone stronger, someone who was finally beginning to embrace herself. I reached up, brushing my fingers along my arm, feeling the warmth beneath my skin, the reality of who I was. It felt good, like I was stepping into my own for the first time. Just as I turned to leave, I heard the faint creak of footsteps behind me. My heart leapt into my throat as I spun around to see Uncle Tom standing in the doorway. His posture was casual, arms crossed loosely, but his gaze was something else. It wasn't the warm, almost dismissive look he usually gave me as his niece. There was something deeper, more contemplative in his dark eyes that I couldn't quite place. "I didn't hear you knock," I said quickly, my voice shaky as I stepped away from the mirror. Heat rose to my cheeks, and I struggled to steady my breathing. His presence, so unexpected and close, felt almost overwhelming. "I didn't mean to startle you," he replied, his tone low and steady. "I was just checking in." There was a moment of silence between us, heavy and charged, before he smiled, a soft, uncertain smile that seemed to mirror my own nervousness. "You look different," he said after a pause, his words catching me off guard. "Different?" I echoed, shifting uncomfortably under his gaze. My pulse raced as I tried to decipher his tone. Was he just being polite, or did he really notice the changes I'd been feeling in myself? "Yeah," he said, taking a step closer. "Like you've grown into yourself. More confident, maybe. It suits you." The compliment caught me completely off guard. No one had ever said anything like that to me before, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. I looked down, trying to hide the blush creeping across my face. "Thanks," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I guess I have been changing." The words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, the silence felt almost too loud. Then, as if realizing the tension, he took a step back, clearing his throat. "Well, I'll leave you to it," he said with a small, almost shy smile. "Just wanted to say hi." As he turned to leave, I felt an odd mixture of relief and something I couldn't quite define. The room seemed quieter after he left, but his words lingered, echoing in my mind long after the door clicked shut. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying that moment in my head. Every interaction with Uncle Tom seemed different now, charged with an undercurrent of something unspoken. There was a warmth in his gaze that hadn't been there before, or maybe I was just noticing it for the first time. Either way, it left me feeling both curious and unsettled. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Uncle Tom invited me on a drive. "Fresh air," he said with a grin, though I could sense there was more to it. As we drove down the winding backroads, the car filled with the golden light of the setting sun, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Something neither of us fully understood yet. The golden light of the setting sun bathed the fields in a warm glow as we drove down the winding road. The hum of the engine provided a steady rhythm, a comforting backdrop to the peaceful silence between us. It wasn't an awkward quiet, but a rare kind of stillness, one that felt natural, as if words were unnecessary. The breeze carried the faint scent of wildflowers, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of belonging, a feeling I hadn't realized I was missing until that moment. Eventually, Uncle Tom pulled the car to the side of the road, into a small clearing we used to visit when I was younger. It was one of those spots that felt untouched by time, a little slice of solitude nestled away from the world. He leaned against the hood of the car, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I joined him, the warmth of the metal beneath me mingling with the cool evening air. The closeness between us was undeniable, comforting yet charged with something unspoken. "Remember this spot?" he asked, his voice soft, almost wistful. I nodded, smiling at the memory. "Yeah, you used to bring me here all the time. You said it was your secret hideaway." He chuckled, a sound rich with nostalgia. "Some things don't change." The sun continued its slow descent, painting the sky in breathtaking hues of orange and pink. We sat there for what felt like hours, neither of us speaking, just soaking in the beauty around us. But as the moments passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. There was an energy in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the quiet before a storm. After a while, he turned to me, his expression softer than I'd ever seen it. "I just want you to know, I'm really glad you're here. It's been a long time since I felt like someone truly understood me." The vulnerability in his words caught me off guard. I placed a hand on his arm, a gesture meant to reassure him, but one that felt far more intimate than I'd anticipated. "I'm glad I'm here too," I said quietly. "I've missed us." His gaze dropped to my hand, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. There was something in his expression, a mixture of surprise and something deeper, something unguarded. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he leaned in. His face was so close to mine that I could feel the warmth of his breath, the steadiness of it contrasting the chaos in my chest. The kiss that followed was soft and hesitant, filled with unspoken understanding. It wasn't rushed or hurried, but a quiet, tender moment that seemed to stretch on forever. When we finally pulled apart, his eyes searched mine, as if looking for confirmation that what had just happened wasn't a mistake. "I don't know what came over me," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Maybe it was meant to happen," I replied, the words surprising even me. He nodded slowly, the weight of my words settling over him. "Maybe," he echoed, his voice filled with a quiet intensity that made my heart race. We stayed there side by side, the silence between us no longer empty but brimming with unspoken truths. The stars began to emerge, dotting the sky with their soft, distant light. He reached for my hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. There were no words exchanged, yet the gesture spoke volumes, a warmth that seemed to say everything we couldn't. The drive back home was quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that felt full of possibility, of things left unsaid but understood. His presence next to me was grounding, a reminder of the connection we'd discovered that evening. When we arrived at the house, he lingered in the driveway, his gaze meeting mine with a softness that made my chest tighten. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For tonight. For everything." I smiled, the corners of my lips tugging upward despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. "Anytime," I replied, the word carrying more weight than it should. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the evening over and over in my mind. The warmth of his words, the closeness we'd shared, It was all still fresh, like an imprint I couldn't shake. It wasn't just the memory of the kiss, it was the way he'd looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time. It was the feeling of being understood in a way I hadn't been before. In the days that followed, those quiet, stolen moments continued. Subtle glances across the room, casual touches that lingered just a second too long. It was as if we were both testing the boundaries of whatever this was, too afraid to define it but unable to ignore it. One afternoon, while we were working on a project in the garage, he brushed a stray strand of hair from my face. The touch was brief but intentional, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze, and in that moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of us. Without thinking, I leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. He froze, surprise flickering in his eyes before a slow, warm smile spread across his face. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice filled with something I couldn't quite name. "For what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "For being here. For understanding." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that left me breathless. The bond between us grew stronger with each passing day, a connection that felt both exhilarating and terrifying in its intensity. There was no denying that something had shifted, that we were no longer who we were before. And while I didn't know where this path would lead us, I knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The golden hues of the sun had long faded into the quiet embrace of twilight, but the air around us felt alive, buzzing with the unspoken truths that hung between us. As I sat beside Uncle Tom on the cliff's edge, his words lingered in my mind. "I don't know where this is going, but I want to find out." There was something about this moment, something fragile yet electrifying. I turned to face him, my own words a whisper against the backdrop of the endless valley before us. "Me too." We stayed there, side by side, as the first stars emerged, their light delicate and distant. It felt like the universe itself was acknowledging this quiet turning point, wrapping us in its vastness while we navigated the space between who we were and who we were becoming. The world seemed to fade, leaving just the two of us sitting in that pocket of time, suspended between the past and an unknown future. In the days that followed, something shifted between us. It wasn't a dramatic change, not the kind you notice all at once. Instead, it was subtle, like the way shadows grow longer in the afternoon. Every interaction carried a newfound weight, a significance we couldn't ignore. There were the glances that lingered a second too long, the quiet pauses in our conversations where neither of us knew what to say, but everything felt understood. One morning, as we prepared breakfast in the kitchen, I noticed how our movements synchronized without effort. I'd reach for a plate, and he'd already have it in hand. He'd glance over his shoulder, asking if I wanted tea, and I'd already be filling the kettle. It wasn't just familiarity, it was connection, a rhythm that felt both new and ancient, as if it had always been there, waiting for us to notice. "I've always liked mornings like this," he said softly, breaking the quiet hum of the room. "There's something about starting the day with someone who gets you." His words were casual, but the warmth in his tone made my chest tighten. I looked at him, and for a moment I felt like I could see everything he wasn't saying. "I feel the same," I replied, my voice steady but my heart racing. One lazy afternoon, he suggested we take the old fishing rods out to the nearby lake, a tradition from my childhood that we hadn't revisited in years. The lake was a short hike through the woods, and the path weaved under the canopy of towering trees, their leaves creating dappled patterns of light on the forest floor. The air smelled of earth and pine, the kind of scent that wraps itself around your memories and stays there forever. When we reached the water, it was as if nothing had changed. The lake was still and glassy, reflecting the deep blue of the sky and the surrounding trees. We settled on the old wooden dock, our feet dangling over the edge, rods cast into the water. "I remember the first time we came here," I said, my voice carrying over the quiet ripples of the lake. "You were so patient, showing me how to bait the hook and cast the line." "I was terrible at it." He chuckled, a sound that warmed the cool air. "You were eager, that's all." I didn't mind. I knew you'd figure it out eventually. I turned to look at him, a smile tugging at my lips. "You've always been good at that." At what? He asked, raising an eyebrow. Believing in me, I said simply. The words hung between us, heavier than I'd intended, but I didn't regret them. His gaze softened, and for a moment, he didn't respond. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine in a gesture so subtle it could have been accidental. But it wasn't. The warmth of his touch lingered, spreading through me like the rays of the sun on a crisp morning. The hours passed in easy conversation and comfortable silences. The fish weren't biting, but neither of us cared. The time felt sacred, like a secret only we shared. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, we packed up and made our way back home, our steps in sync with the rhythm of the evening. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the day in my mind. The way he'd looked at me, the way his laughter had echoed across the lake, it was all etched into my memory, vivid and unshakable. There was a warmth in those moments, a sense of belonging that I hadn't felt in a long time. In the days that followed, this new rhythm between us continued to unfold. We'd find reasons to linger in each other's company, whether it was over a shared cup of coffee in the morning or a quiet walk under the stars at night. There were no grand declarations, no sudden changes in the way we lived, but there was an undeniable shift, a quiet, steady pull that drew us closer. One evening, as we sat on the porch, the crickets humming in the background and the stars scattered like diamonds across the sky, he spoke again in that soft, thoughtful tone I was beginning to know so well. You know, this place, it's not just the view or the quiet that makes it feel like home. It's you. I turned to him, the weight of his words sinking in. There was no mistaking the honesty in his voice, the vulnerability that came with saying something so raw. I feel the same way, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It feels like everything I didn't know I was looking for is here. He reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that felt both natural and profound. In that moment, the rest of the world faded, leaving only the two of us, bound by something neither of us could fully explain, but both of us felt deeply. As the weeks turned into months, life carried on in its usual way, but everything felt different. The simple routines, making breakfast, tending to the garden, even just sitting in the same room, were filled with a quiet intimacy that spoke louder than words ever could. There was no need to rush, no pressure to define what we had. It was enough to let it unfold, moment by moment, like the petals of a flower opening to the sun. And so, we moved forward, not with certainty but with trust. Trust in the connection we'd found, trust in the quiet strength of what we were building. Whatever the future held, I knew one thing for sure: I was exactly where I was meant to be.